Hello everybody, and welcome to Parallax podcast. So, Parallax is a platform for fearless thinking, which explores postmodern ideas that are alive now and talks with various prophets of the meaning crisis. That's for you, John. We're doing lots of cool stuff these days, like a live lecture series with Q&A, a new podcast. We have a new YouTube channel. We have a lot of interviews and articles, and a great series like this Reinventio series we're doing right now. This is our 6th conversation. It's been a wonderful conversation over time. And one more thing is we're in an embryonic stage. We're trying to create a platform and a community. And if you would like to help out, please subscribe, sign up for the podcast, check out our website, and donate if you feel moved to on our Patreon. So, welcome, John Vervaeke and Christopher Mastropietro. Today we're here to talk about love and Eros and love as a virtue. This is this was John's suggestion. I wanted to talk about Eros because I'm a, dirty old man, and you're a scholar, so you wanted to talk about love as a virtue. So would you like to lead us in this conversation, John?
Sure. So I think this is an apt topic for Dialogos because, of course, it's a perennial issue. It reaches deep into the Neoplatonic tradition that Versluis argues is the spiritual grammar of the West. And of course, it overlaps with central notions within Buddhism. We've talked about various aspects of love before. But I think it's also apt for dialectic and Dialogos because this is a topic around which there's, I think, much confusion in our culture, a lot. And then there's aspects of love that importantly are connected to meaning in life, but these are, I think, misrepresented within kind of the popular romanticism that is decadent throughout the culture. There is, of course, within Christianity, at least classically, did a very interesting innovation on the Platonic notion of the way in which love and reason are conjoined together, especially within the Neoplatonic idea of self-transcendence. And Christianity actually came to see love as a virtue. That's, of course, more agape, or at least charitas. And so I think the importance this has on people's life is significant. The confusion around it is also significant and pervasive, which means, I think, in a lot of ways, we need more wisdom about this. And one way I proposed to try and get some more wisdom about this is through framing the question around, it's a question, although I'm making it as a proposal. I propose that love is a virtue, and we should question as to what that could mean. Now, here's my initial reason for why we should think about it at the level of virtue. I'll just take about another 2 minutes, and I'll turn it over to you guys. And this will be the beginning of the clarification. So we have a kind of decadent reduction in meaning around love. We think of love as an emotion, and then we think of emotions as feelings. And to my mind, I'm deeply influenced by the work of Ronnie D'Souza more recently, and Plato more classically. Love isn't an emotion. Love is a existential mode. It's a way of being. If I love somebody, that can cause me to have the emotion of jealousy or happiness or sadness or grief or anxiety, right? So love is more about an existential mode of being in the world. It's not an emotion. Secondly, emotions aren't feelings. Emotion, right? Emotions are ways in which you are oriented into action. They're configurations of your interaction with the world such that you move towards or away from some goal state. So I like Greg Enriquez, my friend Greg Enriquez way of putting that, emotions are energized emotion, and that's how we should think of it. Energized emotions are not the same things as feelings. You can have a feeling and it doesn't do anything. It doesn't energize you, it doesn't motivate you, it doesn't structure, most importantly, your interaction with the world so that you are disposed in action towards carrying various things out. Now, moods are an affective state that might be more like pure feelings. When I'm sort of bored, it's a sort of a feeling. But even moods have a cognitive aspect to them that feelings don't have. Feelings, right? Moods, right? Alter your salience landscape. They give you dispositions and predisposition to what's important and what matters, or perhaps what doesn't matter. Those, of course, symmetrical results from a process that's doing salience landscaping. So I think the fact that we have misunderstood love as an emotion, we have misunderstood emotions as feelings, and then finally we have misunderstood the legitimacy, we have misconstrued the intensity of a feeling with its legitimacy. And that brings me finally to how we would go back up towards virtue. When we want to talk about the appropriateness rather than the intensity of an experience, we would then move into, well, how do we judge its appropriateness? Now, notice how I'm going back up. I would look at how I'm interacting with the world. Well, how do we judge the appropriateness of the interaction? Well, we judge it in terms of the context of what kind of agent-arena relationship, what existential mode. And when we try to go back up, into what makes this feeling legitimate, what makes this interaction legitimate, what makes this existential mode legitimate, we are now talking about virtue. Because virtue is basically, right, a way of arguing, it arguments about virtues are ways of saying that this particular agent-arena relationship, this particular existential mode is wise. And this goes back to the earlier argument about how virtue is the beauty of wisdom. So I think the confusion from existential mode into emotion, into feeling, into the intensity of feeling, we have to do exactly the opposite. We have to conceptually reascend back all the way up to seeing love on the plane of virtue. So that's my core argument.
Oh, that's cool. Can I show you guys something? Just want to very quickly. This is from the let's say a Kabbalistic system, and you can see at the bottom you have the fire,
right?
And there's a plus and minus.
Right.
So this is like the burning bush. Like you can see God's face. You can't really see the back of God, right? Or you can't see the front of God. You could only see the back. I got that mixed up. And then you have, as you go higher and higher, it gets more refined. And at the top, you have a kind of crown, because it has to be. Maybe it's the virtue which crowns this fire that comes from below.
I like that.
I'm contemplating this stuff. So I wanted to, and I was thinking of it as you were speaking. So I wanted to share that.
Well, that's lovely, because that's actually very helpful, because it does something that I think is really essential. Can
I say one more thing?
Sorry.
The fire the fire is sulfur, right, in the alchemical system, and it burns upwards. And then there's mercury, which descends, which kind of cools,
the emergence of the emanation,
which cools it. And so there's, as you say, emergent. It's very similar to, many of the things you speak about. Yeah.
I loved what you just did, though. Sorry for interrupting you. Because you brought in an element that I wanted to be there, but I didn't emphasize enough, that you always see in, like in Plotinus, for example. I was talking about a conceptual ascent, but you were talking about a spiritual ascent, and that's exactly right, because they should be together in the cultivation of a virtue. So we should be talking about both how this is a way of recovering a more appropriate or useful conceptual understanding of love, while at the same time affording the processes of cultivation of self-transcendence that will realize it for human beings. So I think having both those aspects together is very important.
And one more thing before I pass it to Chris is that the interesting thing is, when you study these kind of cards, what you do is first you study them in an intellectual way, like it's conceptual, and you think about it and you make associations in your mind, and then you try to have a purely visual experience,
Yep.
right? Where you actually become closer to the symbol. You become sort of
Yep.
one with the
Yep.
symbol, and then
Yep.
you dissolve the whole thing into kind of emptiness. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I just thought that was very interesting in light of
Well,
what
it's
you were saying, and you might have some insights in terms of cognitive science and all that in that
well,
spiritual
I do.
experience. Yeah, of
I
course
do.
you do. Yeah.
Well, no, I didn't mean
Yeah.
it that way at all. But what
Yeah.
I mean is that to me, I mean, there's a lot going on there about exaptation from a cognitive point of view. But what was, and I think this is relevant to what I'm now going to say, but what that is striking most in me right now from the heart of the Neoplatonic tradition is the practice of theurgia, whereby we go from just conceiving to internalizing, to invoking, and then to actually participating, right? And so in Neoplatonism, you never just did theoria, the contemplative practice. You also did theurgia, in which you're doing this process, which has often been misunderstood and misused, because those often go together, as magic. I don't. In that sense, I don't believe in magic, it's supernatural forces or things that exceeds the grasp of science, as it could be best pursued. But I think that what you're doing is, it's not just metaphorical. That's the point, right? It's not literal, it's not metaphorical, it's transformative. And so that's what theurgia is ultimately about. And I think that's so appropriate to love. Right, and that's why so much of our magic was love magic, because we need. You can't know love without invoking it, because you have to participate in it, or you really don't know it. And the thing, and that to me, that's a crucial link, because virtue is that way too. Virtue is a way of knowing and being. And if you don't have some seed of honesty in you, well, we've talked about this before, you'll be incapable of recognizing honesty, appreciating it, aspiring to it. And so there's something about love that's also got that virtuous aspect of, we have to invoke it to participate in it. But when we invoke it, there's a sense in which some of it was always in us and it had to be there, or we couldn't invoke it or remember it at all. So that all just came up when you held up the card. What's that system? What's the system you're using?
Oh, this is it's a non-theistic system of Kabbalah by a guy named David Cohen Smith, and it's a series of cards that you just contemplate. It's actually it can be used. It can be used. It can be used in a non-theistic, or it could just be used, right?
Yeah.
It's a very beautiful. It's just a series of diagrams like this. I can send you his podcast.
I would love it. I would love to.
Guy, because it kind of blows me away, and I've been comparing it to other systems I've studied, like Dzogchen, and it's
very similar to that.
Similar, and
yeah.
So there's this the internal alchemical aspect, which has to do with the masculine, and the feminine, and the sun and the moon, and all that sort of thing. Which we could also bring into this conversation.
Very much. There's a lot of erotic elements properly described within you with what you just said. So I want to hear what Chris has to say. But Andrew, if you could please, send me some link about that. My interest in psychotechnologies, especially ones that try to situate them within a non-theistic framework and make things practicable for people in an important way. So I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, you would love this guy, I think. Yeah, his work is just our beautiful artist as well. So Chris, what have you had any interesting insights and thoughts that have passed through? I'm dying to hear from you.
Well, it occurs to me that where to begin? So it occurs to me that the virtuosity of love, insofar as it,
I like that.
Insofar as it has to do with the exaptation at the level of our existential moding, it occurs to me that the intervention, right, the philosophic intervention that occurs at the level of that moding, has to do with the way that Eros is fundamentally conceived, definitionally. And
nice pun by there. Nice play on words.
conceived. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Sorry
I
for
use
interrupting, but that was just beautiful. You just do that all the time. Andrew, I hang out with Chris and I write with Chris, and he just does this all the time. It's amazing. Sorry.
It is pure alchemy. I just mentioned alchemy, but if there's something that happens in your mind, Chris, when words go something
it's just
magical that occurs.
You guys are going to make me blush. Okay, let me keep going.
Okay. Not flattering, Chris.
So thank you. Now I've lost my train of thought, guys.
You're talking about the proper conception and intended of Eros.
That's right. So it occurs to me that any inclusive discussion of Eros needs to do the Apollonian and the Dionysian thing that we've talked about in previous conversations, right? The Nietzschean thing of reaching down to the depths of sexuality and to the heights of spirituality. Because it occurs to me that, and this is not, obviously, it's not my idea. This is descendant from the Platonic idea, but then picked up again in the psychoanalytic model, I think, which is that Eros as a kind of drive to totality, certainly in the Jungian formulation, right, with the libido, it's a drive of self-totality and the drive to self-totality. And of course, the drive to self-totality occurs through transmission of others and return from and recovery from our transmission through others. And obviously that maps on to that maps on to the embodiment of Eros in the sexual act. But fundamentally, sexuality is biology and Eros is spirit. And even though and Eros has a presence within sexuality, but Eros fundamentally has a presence within all of our relationships, right? All categories of relationship contain within them, I think, that fundamental life-giving vitality, that force, that energy, as you put it, John. And so then I think the way we treat Eros becomes truly the project of philosophia, right? We've talked about this before, that philia and agape, or what you might call caritas, involve the exaptation of Eros. And so the formulation of Eros in the communing of our relationships in general is necessary for that project.
Oh, yeah. Good point.
Right? So in a way, I think of Eros as that force which inheres the act of semiosis. In other words, Eros is what takes us from speech to speech act. Eros is what fleshes the blood in our spiritual life, if I can use that as a metaphor. So we need to understand how Eros involves the mapping of the intelligible and the sensible, right? And sexuality is a perfect host for that conversation, precisely because it is at that point. You talked about, John, that we're neither talking about a literal nor are we talking about a metaphoric distinction here. We're talking about a form of actuality. Now, the question is, what is this form of actuality and how does it map itself intelligibly and sensibly in the various dimensions of our experience? So I think it's important that I don't know in what order or in what fashion, but I think we have to address it fundamentally. We have to address it at the Dionysian level in order to be capable of addressing it at the Apollonian level. Because one represents its emergence and the other represents its emanation.
Yeah, excellent.
And that's why they need to meet at the synosure and the point of our experience when our drive for self-totality necessitates our communing through the reflection of other selves. And that's why it's so susceptible to modal confusion, right?
Very much.
Because we can pursue ourselves in precisely the wrong fashion and in precisely the wrong direction. And I think some of that modal confusion has to do with the confusion of the emergence and the emanation.
That's beautiful. That's very well said. I like that. It goes to some of the stuff we were working on together, actually.
It does. It's fresh in my mind, as you can tell, John.
Yeah, mine too. So I'm thinking, I've got the the way up and the way down are the same, and we've got the emergence, right? The Dionysian libidinal emergence, and then we have we have to talk about it a bit more. We have the Apollonian, probably curated and cultivated through Philia Sophia, that's emanating downward, right? And then the appropriate relationship to them is, my sense is that's where we'll find the locus, right, of the virtuosity, which is a fantastic word too, Chris. Playing on virtue and optimal gripping. Oh my gosh. Anyways, so I was wondering, this is a question back to you, that point we've got a pivot point, and it's a pivot point of aspect shift. We can look up or we can look down, and we can confuse the up with the down, which we often do. But I'm wondering if that's the pivot point that Plato talks about, where Eros pivots from being consumptive, and I'm playing here on consume and consummation, consumptive to being generative, right? And because we talked about that, we foreshadowed this when we were talking about beauty and how it right, the experience of beauty can be a place, it can be an affordance of that shift where you go from a consumptive, what do we want? Conceptualization, understanding, appreciation of Eros into a generative existential mode. So it strikes me that that pivot point is maybe the crucial point at which we can see the emergence and the emanation coming together, so that we get the initial affording of the virtuosity of love.
That's right. That's right. I
have an image of an egg and sperm, actually, because sperm is, it's a crude image, but there's a multiplicity of activity, and then there's a stillness, and then and so down below you have this multiplicity which is searching for that,
right, and to become one, right? But to become a one that is capable of being generative, right? That's the point, right?
And generative, and I think that the generativity, because that generativity can actually be misread narcissistically. And so I think it's important to be very specific about what we mean by generativity, because you are the generativity of well-cultivated Eros, or virtuously cultivated Eros, is the kind that creates of yourself, but does not simply seek to extend yourself.
Oh, that's good. That's good. That's good. Say more.
Because those are often confused, right? Because, look at it simply at the level of biology. Let's just take it right down to sexuality for a moment, just for the purposes of the example, right? It's sort of like the difference between simply sowing your oats, as it were, to reproduce yourself basely, as profusely as possible, as opposed to producing of yourself in order to raise it into the affordance to become a new kind of being.
Right.
It's the difference between responsible and irresponsible parenting, and no wonder.
Right. And also another presence needs to be involved instead of just instinct.
Totally.
I'm thinking of the double again, of course, because that always comes back in our conversation. This third presence,
and rightly so, because there's an implicit understanding in the virtuously cultivated Eros that the pursuit of one's divine double involves the emanation of mystery into the conception of self. And how can mystery emanate into the conception of self if we are simply extending the scope of ourselves into the world? By the moreness of degree rather than the difference in kind, and the reciprocity of the erotic partner, I think, is what provides the emanation of a lot of that mystery that then becomes, that then reconceives us, as it were.
So this is really good. So I want to slow down on this, Chris, because this is really good. So let me make sure I'm getting you. You're talking about. Okay, so we've got some sort of metanoia pivot, right? And people re-aspectualize. How's that for the word we're looking for? Maybe they really re-aspectualize Eros, right, into being generative rather than consumptive. But that could still go awry in that it could be a will to power, like ego in the second Guardians from the Galaxy, right? The expansion, right? Or that can instead not be just merely expansive. It could be something, and I'm getting a sense that you're now converging with Hahn's work in The Agony of Eros, where he talks about Eros has the capacity to fundamentally decenter us by exposing us, by getting us to really, really confront otherness, right? Otherness. Because this goes back to Plato's idea that Eros is this weird thing in us, because it points to what we have, while also making us realize what is other, what is deeply other that we lack, and we need that. We're fundamentally incomplete. That's Eros is that. Right. Eros is always bidirectional. It's pointing. It empowers us while also making us needy, needful at least. Yeah.
Yes, it's exactly, John.
Mhm.
And think of it like as Eros is halfway transcendent,
Yes.
right? Because think about it as the metaxu between the realms mortal and divine, and that means that it's like the Eckhart's high that sees God, and by which God sees me, right?
Exactly.
It's somehow equidistant. It's equidistant between our necessity and possibility as
That's
well.
in the Symposium, right?
That's right.
Right. That Socrates is compared to Eros, right?
Right. And so our
Oh, that's interesting.
And so our relation to Eros has to, in a sense, leave room for its transcendent half to emanate into it, right? So it's we cannot assume Eros. Eros is not of us, right? There's a reason that it's a spirit that inheres us rather than something that belongs to us. And I think that property of it we need to be heedful of that property if we're to understand. See, because that being heedful of that property also allows us to understand how we can be erotically possessed, right? Like the Jungian anima or animus possession, right? Is I think a variant of that idea. And so understanding its power as dwelling beyond the scope of our means to assume it is an important way of humiliating, in the proper sense of the term, humiliating our relationship to it.
So is Eros a way of embodying emergence that makes us open to emanation?
Oh, that's a great way of putting it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Because that's a great way of putting
it. There's a part of it that we always knew, right? That's the embodied. We're always emerging. We're dynamical systems. We're inherently emergent beings, or we're not alive, right? But Eros is when we embody that emergence in a way that makes us open to the emanation of what is other, that is nevertheless needed by us.
And then think of it in terms of the vulnerability. What you've just described is the vulnerability that we keep talking about in our various conversations.
If you're open to emanation, that would mean that you're open to negative emanation as well. Like you're open to both, demonic possession, or you're open to potential.
Well, let's talk about that.
That's a good point.
Right. So that's why it's a dangerous game, right?
Totally. Well, it has to be, and it's going to go more wrong than right more often, right? Which we all feel, which we all felt in our lives. But I want to pick up on this because I want to really talk about this because I think I'm starting to get a sense of what Chris is talking about, and I think but I want to bring in what you're like. But I don't want to digress. But hopefully the fire of the Dialogos will burn it all together. Okay. Because there's an element in here in which, and this is also part of the Theurgia, in which you're invoking, right, that these things have, and I want to be really careful here because I'm not invoking supernatural or anything. Sorry about that. I'm not invoking anything supernatural or made up of ectoplasmic goo or anything like that. But we're talking about, right, when you talked about demonic versus angelic, we're talking about patterns that we will get called into that have a transhuman aspect to them, right? They transcend, they're definitely transpersonal, they're transegoic. I think this is part of the way in which
archetypal too, right?
The archetypal, all of these terms, all of these ways are ways of trying to say that precisely because it's metaxu, it is demonic, right? And the demonic, notice the etymological association. The demonic is bivalent. It can become the demonic, or it can lead us to the divine, right? Yeah. And so, like when we're caught up, Morton talks about these as hyper objects. We're caught up in patterns that transcend us, that we have to fit ourselves into, and that, right? And of course, they're all around us, these patterns. This is why sometimes I'll sometimes say to people, well, I almost believe in Eros and Aries because I see them as these huge hyper objects, these huge, transpersonal patterns that seem to have a life of their own, independent of any particular individual. And those patterns, right, are being shaped by forces outside of my agency and the agency of people I know, even outside of human agency, they're being shaped by. evolutionary factors, environmental factors, all kinds of stuff. If you think Eros doesn't have to do with the epigenetics coming out of the food you're eating, given the environment you're in. I mean, if you're in a certain environment that has been stressed, you will eat food that will signal to your cells, right, that there's going to be a scarcity, and that will change your libido in a fundamental way, right? And so that's what I mean about this stuff is we're tapping into stuff that's huge and powerful. And so what I'm trying to do, Andrew, is to, I hope you don't find it a travesty, but I'm trying to give a purely naturalistic account of what would typically be sort of mythological ways of talking about Eros.
I was listening to your conversation about miracles today.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's exactly. I'm trying to do exactly the same thing.
A naturalistic. Can we give a naturalistic account of miracurs?
Well, yeah, let's not do that right now. But
no, that would be that would be too long a conversation. Well, when I say demonic possession, I guess it's just a short form for because I don't have the technical language to go into or maybe I just like short forms. I like broad strokes.
Well, that's fine. And the advantage of, well, think of your cards. There's a theurgic advantage of representing these things, with narrative images, because it makes them much more readily internalizable. However, there is a compensatory power to rendering them in scientific terms, because then we can see their connections to things like the ecology, to things like biology, to things like evolution. And that has a value and a power that should be acknowledged as well.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Mm-hmm. It's like, this all reminds me, there's a W.H. Auden poem that starts by going something like this, right? We're lived by the powers that we pretend to understand, and they arrange our loves. And that's, and however we choose to profile or characterize those powers. I mean, there's a reason that the sort of the apotheosized renderings of those powers are so powerful, precisely because when we're subsumed into those forces, they do seem to co-opt our agency and drive us to behaviors that we otherwise would not expect from ourselves, right? And they're transegoic in that sense. And understanding the transegoic nature of those powers is essential to being able to commune with them without becoming susceptible to the existential pathologies that we know them to induce, right? Like the kind of the volatility of nihilism and absurdity and alienation and those things that drive us to forms of mania. I don't mean it in a clinical sense, but just in general, right?
Well, virtue is this landscape. I mean, sorry, Eros creates a dangerous landscape, and we can only become we have to become virtuosos to navigate that landscape. That's what you're kind of saying.
Eros. Yeah, that
makes sense to me. Yeah,
and it's telling that the great atheist Nietzsche invokes a property of God about Eros, because he talks about the omnipresent power of sex, which is like whoa. Like for Nietzsche, whatever else Nietzsche is, he's using his words, and he's using his words with forethought. Right. And he's talking. So he has these, and he has such a tortured relationship with his own sexuality. Right. But the depths of my sexuality reach into the height of my spirituality, the omnipresent power of sexuality. But he is even talking to it in a way that is, metaxu, between the everyday and what used to be called the divine. And I think a proper respect for that, that the demonic can go demonic, is important. I think that's very important, Andrew.
And Freud picks up on that, right? So spectacularly. That's one of the reasons why Freud became as one of the that's one of Freud's chief insights that he picks up from Nietzsche, right? And in that sense he manages to scope himself
in a way. I think sorry, I interrupted you again, but
no, go ahead, please.
The way I think that sometimes at times I heard John talk about yin and yang in terms of this, dynamic systems, and I wanted to say, can we talk about sex? Because it's much more primordial. If we're always talking about its abstractions like this, I think that is the power of Freud, right? That's why Freud is so.
But But it's also,
that's also why Freud is so fraught. And, at the same time, it's like, because when you talk about this, when you go into this area, you're entering a minefield, but in a way we have to do it somehow, I think.
But I think that's Freud's great mistake. And that's, I mean, Jung has many critiques of Freud, some better, some worse. But one of his great critiques of Freud is Freud's reduction of Eros or
everything to sex,
into sexuality.
Sex,
sure,
right?
That's right.
This is the fundamental mistake. We are confused. This is an example of the version of the representativeness heuristic. Sex is such a salient and clear example of Eros that we are tempted, and here I think is a demonic aspect of temptation. We're tempted to identify it reductively with sexuality. I'm not trying to sidestep your request, Andrew, but I'm saying I think we should, if we're going to,
Well, it's like masculinity and femininity also is something that is so difficult for people to talk about these days.
Yeah.
Well, but there is, I think it's there. You can't just call it yin and yang or something like that. That seems to be a kind of the opposite of the Freudian reduction. It's too much of an abstraction.
Well,
one way.
Could we do both?
That would be the best, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Right. Because I don't want to reduce. Like, it's even in language, like in French, things are masculine and feminine. That has nothing to do with gender or sexuality. There's this deeper way in which we try to organize reality, and that's what I'm trying to point to with yin and yang. That isn't bound even to gender, and it's especially not bound to sexuality. It's funny though, because it does color thought. Because apparently, languages in which death is like English doesn't have this, so we struggle to talk about it, but I know a bit of French, right? So, in languages in which death is feminine, people are disposed to representing it in imagery in a feminine way, as opposed to other cultures where it comes out, right?
Well, in this system that I was looking at, the moon is actually usually represented as feminine. Here it's masculine.
There you go.
And the sun is represented as feminine because the masculine reflects or something.
That's
the masculine is a reflecting power rather than a
productive power, generative power. That's good.
Yeah. I love that Gnostic play.
That's cool.
I like it when people, that's what the Gnostics were great about, to go back and take simple symbols that were getting entrenched and then becoming demonic and holding us down and opening them up again for re-expression, revitalizing them.
Turning them into icons.
That's beautiful, Andrew. But that's exactly it. So, part of the danger around the sex talk and the masculine and feminine talk is exactly that kind of entrenchment that makes it so difficult to get, because remember how I at least wanted to start this. I'm really trying to resist this downward reduction of Eros, right?
One basic way, I think, this doesn't involve so much the masculine feminine dimension of the conversation, but one way to very simply, none of this is simple, but one way to begin disentangling the reduction of Eros to sexuality is to go right down into the sexual act and to realize how unerotic it can actually be. Yeah. And then to do the inverse, and to realize how unsexual Eros, the presence of Eros in relationships, can also be. And once we begin to think in those terms, then the reduction doesn't hold very well, and it doesn't hold very fast, right?
That's
most people have experiences of unerotic sex in their lives, and as soon as this language can become cultured into the conversation, we realize pretty quickly. And we could even think of it now. It's not a one-to-one identity claim I'm making here, but one way of conceptualizing that is to look at the presence of intimacy in the sexual act, right? Because, of course, a lot of sexual acts don't have intimacy. But when intimacy is suffused into the sexual act, it changes the semiosis of sexuality utterly and completely, right? Unintimate sex and intimate sex may as well belong to different categories of experience. And that's something that we don't have a very good education about these things now. And so most people don't grow up realizing there's a difference.
I agree with you about that totally.
That's brilliant, Chris. And now things are like coming to mind together, right? You've got virtuosity, you've got intimacy and finesse, right? There's the element of finesse, right? Because intimacy is like it connotes, it requires, right, sensory motor finesse, both an appropriate sensitivity, the vulnerability, but also a terrific sense of timing and placement. If you want to be intimate with somebody, you have to, I mean, this was Pascal's point, you have to have tremendous finesse. And the overlap, you see what I'm playing with? The overlap between virtuosity and finesse, right?
Oh, I like it. And also it brings in the idea of the kairos, right? Because the importance of timing. You have to catch right. It's emergence. The emergence of the eros through your person has to correspond with its emanation through the kairos of opportunity.
Right, exactly. Kairos is the pivot point, right? That we're talking about with the emergence and the emanation. That's brilliant.
That's it.
Which is an opening and also could be a crisis at the same time.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So, and every moment of intimacy, even sexual intimacy, is fraught with the real possibility of judgment, right? And a turning, which is what crisis originally meant: judgment and the possibility of turning,
and utter annihilation along with it.
But I think this is, oh my gosh. So I like this, that we're getting at something of the virtuosity and the finesse of eros and its connections to intimacy, and that what we're actually trying to talk about. So Chris, and I like this idea, because the idea of embodied emergence that makes us open, sensitive, finessable of the emanation of the otherness, vulnerable, right, all of that. And then now I'm trying to get at it, because I want to go back to Andrew's point. So this is the intimacy, the aspect shift. So we have the generative rather than the consumptive. Is the intimacy the aspect shift that moves us out of the will to power into, right, the generative that is the virtue? Why I'm thinking about this is the non-erotic sex was, as you said, somebody just sowing their seed, right? Remember you gave that example of the generatives of purely dissemination and actually no cultivation of intimacy. And it sounds to me like now the difference is we're talking about, a generativity that requires and is directed towards intimacy of what's going on in eros. Is this gathering for you the same?
Yeah. I think that's a good point, John. I think it's important. Understanding intimacy as the sort of fulcral pivot shift point is important. And then that makes a lot of sense if we begin to unspool all that we mean by intimacy and unspool it into the dynamics of sensibility transcendence, right?
Right.
The interpenetration of perspective, the co-internalization of perspective, right? That in and of itself is a deeply erotic act. And so it's no wonder that it's fulcral if that's what we mean by intimacy. And I think we do in this context.
So the intimacy is then the dynamic affordance making possible of internalization, of internalizing the other as the other, and vice versa. So it's also getting us into that reciprocal opening kind of idea that, right, that we talk about when we feel like we're actually, this is Aaron's point, when we're falling in love with somebody, we get intimacy as the affordance of that reciprocal internalization of the other. I think that's really, really cool.
I was thinking of the Zen phrase, not one, not two, right?
Yes, exactly. There's a non-duality happening. Exactly. And I was thinking about how we've come this weird full circle, because when I've internalized the other, I've now exapted the consumptive form of eros into this much more virtual, right, in the sense of virtuosity and possibility sense of eros. Because now, right, but instead of consuming the other, or just having consummated a relationship, I've actually internalized them into my own self-transcendence. They have become a way in which I rise above myself.
That's right. So then generating of oneself in eros is really the act of co-generating the combinative relationship of those people, right? So then if the other has been internalized, then the generation of oneself is really the generation of both.
That's amazing. That's really good. I really like that. That's really powerful.
I was also thinking about kind of, the search for peak experiences and then the valley experiences, and the contrast between the peak and the valley somehow, in terms of erotic.
Curious across that, right? The
Mhm.
point about intimacy is, of course, there's the anagogue, like you said, that mutual self transcendence, the peak, but the valley is also where if we're genuinely intimate, right? It's the fallow furrow in which we can,
Yeah.
right, make ourselves ready again to be sensitive and finesse our sensitivity towards the other. And one of the wisest people I met in my life, he often said, like, you have being, love and faithfulness is, and I know this is a common metaphor, but I had heard it for the first time from him. He says, what you're doing is you're dancing with the other person, and your movements aren't the same. There's no constancy in your movement or their movement. What you're trying to do, and in fact, the distance between you will also vary. You'll move away and towards each other.
Yeah.
But what you'll find is basically what he's saying is that there's a rhythm. There's a rhythm that you slowly acclimatize to and that you internalize and participate in, like music. And then you start to get carried along by that rhythm.
Yeah, it's a thread or a melody, or
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. And that I might argue that is that rhythm, the discovery of that rhythm becomes one of the preconditions for the project of Philia Sophia.
Yeah,
right?
Totally. I think so. That's exactly right. And so, yeah, this idea of love as like a virtuosity and a finessing of sensitivity and sensibility that then makes us capable, like you said, of Philia. I think that's really good, Chris. I mean, I think that's a very, very good articulation and development of ideas that I had seen nascent for me, not nascent in Plato. They were nascent in my reading of Plato, and I think you've helped to bring them out and make them clear.
It's sort of like, if I could put it in a catchphrase, it would be like the cultivation of Eros is the existential sensitization to ontological intelligibility.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really what we're doing.
Yeah. It's like an arena but
right.
what we do, and this is what we're always doing when we're cultivating a virtue, is we're turning the arena, right, into a dojo. We're turning the arena, in, like the Stoics would say, into a stadium, a training stadium, right? We're not just simply being in the arena, we're training in the arena.
That's right. Great.
Yeah, and the arena is a total environment too, isn't it? It's not just you and the other person.
Exactly. I mean, that's why love is so devastating when we lose someone, because they are a doorway into a world and a way of being that is irreplaceable. No other being, not including aspects of ourselves, no other being, no other person, no other sequence of events will give us that doorway, that access to that particular way, the suchness. That's the sensibility transcendence, the specific suchness, right, that person is.
Yeah, you know the story of Rumi and Shams or whatever.
Yeah.
That made me think of that because what was the story? They were just so in love with each other that the disciples killed Shams, and he was heartbroken, and he wandered the earth for forever until he just had this realization that Shams was everything, or Shams was everywhere. Yeah. So I maybe what my thought was that we have to have that experience of loss, like that's a necessary experience in order really to not get trapped in that, I don't know, in that limitation of just one person or
Oh, that's a good point, Andrew.
And then we can actually be with another person after that, because we've gone through that. It almost seems to be like written into how things happen, or.
Yeah, it's a necessary suffering. And it's a necessary suffering because, of course, two people raise a sky between them, right? Yeah. And when you have the experience of the sky falling, you suddenly realize the stakes of the project so that you approach them with care, greater care, as you return again.
But I'm mixing Han and Stoicism here. I hope I'm not mixing metaphors. But if we are really appreciative of the otherness, we are always, to some degree, foreseeing loss, because otherness is exactly that which escapes ultimately our control, right? And that which escapes our control is ultimately that which we can lose.
Right. That's where the numinosity that gilds the experience can confer itself onto horror.
Yeah, exactly. And you can get moments in a relationship. Now, some of these come from, defensive mechanisms, and they come from insecurities, but you can also just get that moment that is free of that kind of psychopathology, at least at least as much as possible as it can seem to be. And yet you wake up and you just reflect on the fact that your beloved might not be at some point. And again, it's one of those strange experiences that really, and the Stoics actually advocated it as a practice. Right, like that you constantly remind yourself of the fatality and mortality of everything and everyone that you love. And the thing is, that was not meant to undermine the love, which is, again, if you confuse love with the intensity of a feeling, this idea of reflecting on the mortality and fatality of the beloved seems oxymoronic. Why would you possibly do that? But if you understand it as an intimacy with otherness, then of course that Stoic practice makes a lot more sense. Yeah. It's like the Buddhist practice to some degree of reflecting on the corpses, right? In contemplating the corpses in order to enhance your capacity.
Sure. I remember I visited a retreat center, and there was on the walls were these copulating gods. It was just brilliant colors, and on the ground was corpses of animals and
right.
And this was what they were contemplating. It's like to keep those two things in mind.
Right.
Yeah.
There's something else I just wanted to bring in before we veer away from it, which is that you were saying, John, that that the relationship, that the dance, when the rhythm's coherent, pronounces an implicit sense of tragedy that comes with the fatality of the beloved, and then the fatality of the world that you co-create. And it occurs to me too that you could shift its aspect and you could invert it, because what it also does is it pronounces your own fate, the fatality of your union can emanate from yourself.
Yes.
In addition to emanate from the other, or rather can emerge through yourself, in addition to emanating from the other person. And so the emanation and the emergence that comprise the relationship are both at risk from the threat of that fatality. Because because you have internalized that other, and the world becomes intelligible from the perspective of that other, you then become a source of that same fatality, which is incredibly existentially undermining. It undermines your sense of existential agency. If you yourself all of a sudden become a source, an unpreventable source of your fatality and of the fatality of the other person. And that, I think that what that does is it introduces the concept of sin into the mix as well.
That's well said. I like that.
Sin. Yeah. Sin is somehow always bound up with sexuality in a way, isn't it? Why is that?
Well, or at least with Eros.
Yeah, with Eros, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at it in the Old Testament, it's not deeply bound up with sexuality. I mean, they overlap, but it doesn't approach the degree of identification that you have in the Christian tradition.
Oh yeah, it's intense in the Christian tradition with Augustine and St. Paul and
yeah, very much.
But the Augustine, boy, that moves us into some complex territory. But I think that Augustine's relationship to sin and Eros, I think, is misunderstood a lot, right? Mm-hmm. Because Augustine is a great Christian proponent of Eros, but Augustine understands the threat of its reducibility, of its reduction.
Which is why he describes why he's so obsessed with hell, I think.
And original sin, the idea,
hell, just the idea, like he believed there's this eternal hell that you go to, right? Which I think I read somewhere that the Orthodox don't actually believe that. This was concocted by Augustine, and probably it's because the sin is so deep, right? Or the loss or the pain of sexuality is so deep. You can imagine that you would imagine the opposite.
I think,
does that make any sense, or what I'm saying here?
It does. I think that's part of what's going on in Augustine's psyche. I've come to the conclusion that I think he suffered from sexual addiction, and the way he describes it, licking the earth and scratching the open sore of lust. I was always doing that kind of language. I think Chris is right. He experiences Eros as a gravitational force that either pulls you upward to God or can pull you downward. And I think he thinks that the gravity well, right, has to bottom out in something as, opposite to God as possible. And so that's complete chaos, complete separation, complete entrapment in self-absorption, in the incapacity for connection, intimacy. And I think he thought that he had a foretaste of what hell must be like when he stole the apple, which was also for him an erotic act, right? Yeah. Or the pear. It was a pear, right?
Pear.
When he stole the pear, and when he was, basically whoring around, because that's literally what he was doing. I think he experienced that, and I think in his mind there's a kind of symmetry. Our greatest.
I wonder if you could compare him to certain characters in the East, right? Who really celebrate sexuality and believe it can bring people into enlightenment, and went to the whorehouses and drank with the criminals, and like there's this morbidity or something around that.
I love Augustine in a lot of ways, and I find his honesty, especially in the Confessions, I find it very valuable. I do disagree with a lot of the conclusions he drew. He gets into some terrible knots about how we're, around original sin and predestination, and some ideas that I think are really hard to reconcile with human psychology and human behavior. So I do appreciate what he's saying. And part of what we try and do in dialogos, right? Well, in dialectic, when it becomes dialogos, is but in addition to just evaluating arguments, we try to presence people. We try to, this is the theurgia. We should to some degree be trying to invoke Augustine here, presence him as a voice, or as Chris and I sometimes say, as a Geist, whose perspective we will, like we do with any other human being, we will internalize it to varying degrees. And that's a different process from evaluating and judging particular philosophical claims. So while I have many criticisms of some of his philosophical claims, I find the presencing of Augustine around the topic of Eros incredibly valuable, because his capacity for suffering how the demonic can become demonic, and yet finding a way out of that. I think that's really valuable for the virtuosity that we're trying to cultivate here. There's a virtuosity in him, again, separate from his theoretical claims, which many of them I want to challenge, but there's a virtuosity.
But are those separate? Are they separate, the theoretical claims and the life lived?
Well, they may not be separate in him, but they're separable for me, because I can find the same virtuosity, or at least a similar virtuosity, in other people who espouse different propositions from those of Augustine, right? And so
I didn't want to damn Augustine or anything like that. I just want to show that there would be another attitude towards sexuality that wouldn't be so I don't know, full of hellfire and damnation. That
there is
now that would be more in the East, in the tantric tradition, which seem to have more wisdom around that than we do still in the West, with our obsession with porn and.
But that's exactly it, right? I think I think of myself very much as sort of a naturalistic Neoplatonist, but one area in which I reject Neoplatonism, and this comes from the naturalism and the 4E cognitive science, Neoplatonism's rejection of the body and how that got taken into aspects of Christianity and maybe mistaken into Christianity by people like Augustine is something that I think is deeply mistaken and has been deeply harmful. Now, there are ways of rereading of that, and whether or not it's revisionist or not is a difficult question, because very often when the Neoplatonists are talking about the body, often they are talking about the body, literally the body, but often they are also talking about the having mode. They're talking about that consumptive embodiment of Eros that is gravitating us downward rather than the generative, right, virtuosity of Eros that is gravitating us upward. And when they're
I'm sorry to push back. I almost want to push back because I want to say that we need the gravitation downward and the gravitation upwards. It's like in the Hindu temples, you have all these copulating, things, and then inside the temple, something else is going on. But that's I want to have a larger acceptance of all facets of existence, including the downward and the upward. That's rather than privileging the upward all the time. What?
I want to ask you what you're asking for. Do you want to go downward, or do you want to understand the downward? You want to become vicious, or do you want to understand vice? There's a difference between those two.
Oh, good question.
Right? I want to, like you, at least there's an overlap in that I want to understand vice very deeply. And that means understanding it in a way in which I can identify it within myself, not just intellectually. But I don't want to become vicious.
Yeah, I met a Zen master once, and he said, "I don't know these Christians. Like, I pray every day to go to hell." And I thought, well, I don't, but I'm not that brave, right? But maybe there are some people who are brave, and maybe it's more. Maybe I don't know. I don't want to go to hell, no. But and I don't want to downward. But I don't. All this down and up stuff too. I don't want to. I want to cut away this dualism of body and soul and.
But that's exactly right. But is there a way? Right? Is there a way of Okay, so we don't want to reduce love to just the having mode. We've been talking about that, and so we want to step aside from that. And is there a way of re-insinuating the body into our spirituality, like Nietzsche recommended, that deals with, I think, in places, a real black mark on Neoplatonism, which is the abuse of the body and the denigration of the body. And I think there is. I think there's ways of doing that. And so for me, again, Augustine is a pivotal figure because he represents the light and the dark of this. He represents, right? Yeah. But I also see, right, the denigration of, this is what I mean about some of the philosophical aspects of his that I reject. The denigration of the body, the notion of original sin, right, as a disease we're born with, I think is a great category mistake. It's a really great category mistake that he's made, because he's trying to make it like a property of our embodiment rather than a property of our behavior, which I think is a deep mistake. That's why I think the Buddhist notion of dukkha, that we are always susceptible to self-deception, is a much better, is a much more helpful way of trying to understand this.
Yeah, Chogyam Trungpa thought you should replace original sin with basic goodness and that primordial goodness, right? Because you can't say the color red is bad or good, or it's just the color red. It's good, sexuality is good. It's not. There's nothing inherently bad about it or sinful about it. But it can lead to sin. But that's
But I would push back on that a little bit, though, to say that one of Augustine's insights is that prototypical experiences of sexuality often manifest in the modally confused eros.
They do.
And so, for Augustine, the experience of the modal, being anachronistic and attributing that term, obviously he didn't put it in that way, but Augustine's formative experiences with modally confused eros in the form of concupiscent sexuality was a necessary suffering for him in order to leaven his gaze to the affordances of eros that were metanoetic.
Yeah.
And he needed that, like those experiences from the pair on and his you know, his suite of lovers, but there's a clear progression with him too, right? You know, at some point he settles and he has one lover for a period of time before he moves on from it entirely. And then he talks about how that erotic drive confers itself into the philia of his relationships, into the fellowship of his Holy Spirit. Like there's a clear kind of anagogic, not to romanticize his journey too much or anything like that, but there's a clear anagogic journey that he undertakes. And when he looks back to survey it, he understands that the sinfulness of those prototypical sexual experiences was necessary for him in order to turn himself in the direction of Eros's rightful gravitation.
So you have to sin in order to repent. That's what some of the Jews say. Like,
in essence,
you need to sin. Yes. You got to sin, right?
Yeah. And Kierkegaard picks up on some of that, right? The necessity of sin, the necessity of, I mean, it's a really complex part of Christian theology. I don't know if I fully understand it, but the necessity of sin is not. It's important not to understand. I'm not saying you do, but a lot of people understand it very superfluously, and I think it's very important not to.
Sure. This is where I think Augustine makes his biggest mistake. I think he confuses his own undeniable psychological indispensability with a metaphysical necessity in the doctrine of original sin, right? It could be that somebody else goes through the experiences he goes through, and they are so traumatized by them that they fall into an inescapable bestiality, right? I get it that for him, and especially in his historical context, that sinning may have been necessary to him, and necessary to him, I think it only makes sense in terms of psychological indispensability. But there's dangers to this. Let me give you a concrete example rather than abstract. We have adopted the narrative framework of Augustine. We've taken it into 12-step programs, and the idea that people have to be broken, they have to hit rock bottom before they can get free. And for some people, yes, but for many, many people, and there's empirical evidence of this, no, right? Leaving them till they hit rock bottom, or not trying to help them till they hit rock bottom, or all, like, these can be actually therapeutic, deeply therapeutic mistakes. And so that's what I mean. I think
that's like when ideology and dogma, kind of poison the actual natural human processes or something like that.
Well, it can be. And what I mean is, look, there's a difference between taking Augustine's Confessions as illustrative, as an illustrative narrative that can be helpful, and then instead understanding them as the inescapable process that all human beings must go through, and that's where I jump off. Maybe we disagree on that point, Chris. But for me, the variability in human beings across time and across culture just undermines the idea that there's a metaphysical necessity to that particular narrative. I just don't agree with it. I think,
that's fine, and I'm not arguing for its metaphysical necessity either. I'm arguing within the confines of its psychological necessity in the context of Augustine's life. But I'm trying to also illustrate that the scope of his understanding of Eros involved a kind of progression along the great chain that we've just described, and that his understanding of its ambit and its sexual and its non-sexual manifestation had everything to do with the experiences that he contemplated. So I don't think it's necessary that he wrote the first
biography, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's interesting. He was the guy who wrote the first biography, like the first person.
No, he wrote the first autobiography.
Autobiography. That's an interesting, the autobiography or something is the. I don't know what my thought about it. That has something to do with a hidden. It seems to me that there's a hidden narcissism to the biography, the autobiography, which means that he didn't get to the final thing. But maybe I'm.
Well, that autobiography is tricky though, right? Because he's overhearing himself. He's overhearing himself talking to the transcendent interlocutor.
Yeah, it's a dialogue,
and that's very important. I don't think it's a narcissistic enterprise at all. I think it's.
I felt I was wrong when I was saying that. Yeah.
Well, no. But it's not a bad. It's not a. It's like that's a good provocation, Andrew, because the same kind of behavior there's a very, very thin line we're talking about here. And the same kind of behavior replicated in a different, under the auspices of a different project, could very well have been narcissistic. So aspectually, I think that's an easy equation to make. Absolutely. So I don't think it's a silly thing to say at all. But I think in the Augustinian context, I think it's clear that, especially in the progression of his overall corpus, it's clear that he wants to hear himself in conversation with the divine, with eternity.
It's inherently dialogical. It's not the monological autobiography of the narcissistic celebrity. It's very, very fundamentally different. It is a very finessed, right, sensitivity to the otherness of God, right, that is coming into. He's that, right. It's a very different thing. I want to now I want to acknowledge what Chris is saying, right? There is this the finessing of the sensitivity to the otherness of God, right? That vulnerability. There's that deeply erotic component running through the Confessions, powerfully. And I think Chris is right that Augustine's, it goes towards the symmetry I was talking about earlier, the symmetry between hell and God. His experience of hell, the hell of sexual addiction, sensitized him to the movements of Eros such that he was able to move upward. Again, I know, Andrew, you don't like the upward and downward.
No, that works for me completely. It's just like, Dante and everything. I'm sure.
Yeah, very much. Very much.
Yeah.
But there's a point that came out in the discussion between Chris and I that I think is valuable, which is part of what I want to play with. We're running out of time, I know, but part of the finesse is learning to take these narratives of Eros as illustrative, but not as finally definitive or complete. Because one of the problems I see in the current culture within the sort of popular romanticism is that we are becoming formulaic in the presentation of Eros in a way that makes it seem, and you see people living this mistake out, as if these narratives are not just illustrative, as if they're definitive, final, and unavoidable. And I think that is pernicious. And that's the point that I actually wanted to return to in what I wanted to say to you, Chris. So that's why I was putting sort of emphasis on that point, right? Part of the finesse to my mind is exactly how to take these narratives of Eros as illustrative without turning them into formulaic dogma.
That's right. That's a good point, John. And I think we overcome the notion of necessary erotic experience when we understand Eros to be the supernal spiritual force that we've described earlier in our conversation.
Yeah.
Right? If it's not of us, then its experiences and the dimensionality of its articulation through our experiences cannot be so easily predictive.
It would be good. First of all, we got rid of the whole genre of romantic comedies because of the way they try to bend the fatality of the universe to people's erotic enterprises and all kinds of bullshit like that. But it would also be good if we brought back what used to be present in literature, right? Good literature, which is, right, an understanding of the variability, the many ways, the many forms, the many kinds of narratives of Eros, the different ways in which people fall in love with each other. I mean, this is a commonplace thing to say, but you don't see it in any way valorized or made central in romantic, the way romance is portrayed today. Every romantic relationship I've had to like, what do I want to say? I've had to reflect on because of it, the importance it had to me. So I'm not talking about trivial, like, experiences. I'm talking about the ones that matter. That's what I'm trying to say. They're all different. They're all very, very different. It's only the only way it seems where they're similar are those ones that were superficial. The ones that were, like you say, just disseminating your seed, as you put it, Chris, right? Right? Do you only get
even those ones are kind of interesting, when even those ones where you're just disseminating your seed remain in my memory somewhere as being an encounter with something that an open door or
well maybe. Well, okay, well maybe our phenomenology is different, so maybe I should be more careful. It strikes me though that the ones that are superficial seem relatively the same.
Well, yeah.
where the ones that are deep seem so profoundly different to each other. And it worries me that romantic comedies present the erotic experience as fundamentally the same, which to me is an argument that they're probably staying at a very superficial level.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that the argument you just made, John, from difference and sameness, we also made in our last conversation as a defining property of genuine friendship.
Yes.
And that is not a coincidence.
Yeah, exactly.
Because what I'm really interested in addition, I mean, the context of Eros, it's the life of Eros and in the form of a romantic relationship, of course, is its own. That's very much its own beast. But what I'm also very much interested in the presence of Eros within Philia, because I think, as we've discussed, right, that the cultivated Eros is a precondition of Philia, and so it's very interesting, right? I'm not saying it's a one to, obviously there's no identity claim to be made. They are different categories of relating. However, they do share that common feature. And that common feature is what binds the internalizing property and allows it to flourish.
And I could feel that between you guys, for example, just this intense love, right? Between two male, and there's, I don't know what you do in your bedroom, but I assume that this is not about that, right? But it is equally, and it could be equally intense as a sexual relationship, I would think.
Yeah,
and
platonic Eros. That's
what
it is.
We don't really valorize that.
I think that's important. I think that's very. And Chris, I hope I didn't convey that when I was talking about romantic relationships, I was reducing Eros to that. I was just trying to use that as an example.
Oh, you weren't. I just wanted to, I just wanted to remind us all that when we're talking about the valence of Eros within a relationship, we're talking about it in the form of all relationships.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it sort of inhabits. It's like a spirit that inhabits all the other forms of friendship or relationship.
Right.
That's how I see it. Yeah.
But it's like also like we said about virtue. Virtue is the beauty of wisdom. Like it's the way of being specifically wise in this context. Eros, right, in this relationship, right. It's funny. It's Eros here, and it's Eros here, and it's Eros here. But that doesn't mean that this relationship and this relationship and this relationship are the same.
Because the Eros has both. To use your language, John, the Eros has both the suchness and the moreness. Right. Exactly. Each individual is each is irreducible. Each instance is irreducible, and it's unaccountably unique. Yeah. And yet each ascends to the same shared source of intelligibility.
Yeah. Right. So that again would circle back on how the virtuosity of being able to embody the emergence, to be open to the emanation, would be the finessing of the moreness and the suchness, the moreness into the suchness, and the suchness into the moreness. That's what it is. I mean, sorry, that sounds like but to me, because it captures what Wright was talking about sensibility transcendence. You're trying to not get a generic categorical understanding of this person. You're trying to get their suchness. But we're also, as you just said, we're also trying to be open to, there's so much more of them than I can possibly ever know.
That's right. And we can discover ourselves infinitely in the world that becomes populated by the phenomenology of that relationship, that single relationship.
Yeah, so I think I was thinking also about why these conversations are interesting, and I think that's, I guess, dialogos affords.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's when these conversations feel alive and interesting, and not just blah blah blah. It's when we're inhabited by that spirit of Eros.
If it wasn't a politically problematic thing to say, I would say that dialectic is an inherently erotic practice. It's a practice that's designed to invoke Eros, turn it from consumptive to generative, and then turn it from merely expansive to intimate.
And it gives you a reason to live in a way, doesn't it? I mean, it makes. I could even be so dramatic as to say, like, without that, you don't have a reason to live. Like, it gives you a reason to live. Like.
I would certainly agree with that statement, Andrew. Yep.
Well, I think I think reason, I mean, this is Frankfurt's notion, and I've done an argument on it. I think reason, when we're talking about reasons for something, we're talking about the way of caring about things that a way of caring about things that is so viable for us that trying to live in a way, in another form of caring is not possible for us. I mean, this is what he means when he talks about the unthinkable and in the reasons for love. My love for my son, right, is a way of being for me, such that while I can imagine, kicking him out of my apartment because it would be so much more cleaner and saving money, and I can drive all the implications, and I can do all that inference.
I have a 1-year-old, so
I'll never
get a
bring
lot more sleep.
I'll never bring myself to do it because to do that would be to so malform the kind of caring with which I've identified that it would be more of a suicide of my soul than many other acts I could possibly perform.
So that's a virtue too, right? That's going back to virtue. That's
virtue. It's a virtue because
it's not virtue as this concept of being a good boy or being good or bad, or it's much more profound than that.
It's a way of disciplining your caring so that you are reliably tempted to the good.
Yeah. I love that turn of phrase you made there, John, about how the prospect of severance and an ultimate relationship of that kind is tantamount to the suicide of the soul. I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. That says it.